75 million people died in agony, their bodies covered in black swollen boils, and no one knew why. To understand what happened next, we have to go back to the 14th century. Europe was a world of crowded towns, busy markets, merchant ships, farms, animals, and constant human movement. People traveled between villages and cities. Merchants carried goods across long distances. Ships connected distant ports. And somewhere within this enormous network, an invisible organism was moving with them. Today, we know that the Black Death was associated with the bacterium Yersinia pestis. Medieval people had no idea it existed. They couldn't see bacteria. They couldn't test blood. They couldn't examine a swollen lymph node under a modern microscope. They could only watch what happened to the human body. And the first signs could be terrifying. A person might suddenly develop a fever. They could become extremely weak. They might experience chills, headache, and severe illness. Then came one of the most recognizable signs of bubonic plague, a painful, swollen lymph node called a bubo. These swellings could appear around the groin, armpit, or neck. To a modern doctor, that swelling can be an important clinical clue. To a person in the 14th century, it could look like something completely unnatural. Imagine waking up with a painful swelling on your body. You have never heard of bacteria. Nobody around you understands what is causing it. And then you discover that someone else in your neighborhood has developed something similar. Then another person. Then another. The fear would not come from one sick person alone. It would come from realizing that the sickness was appearing in multiple households. And the plague did not always affect the body in exactly the same way. Bubonic plague primarily involves the lymphatic system. Septicemic plague affects the bloodstream. Pneumonic plague affects the lungs and can spread through respiratory droplets. These forms could produce different clinical patterns. But medieval people didn't have modern medical terminology to separate them. They simply saw an illness that could become devastatingly severe. And there was another problem. They didn't know exactly how it was moving from one place to another. Today, scientists know that Yersinia pestis can circulate among animal populations, and that fleas can transmit the bacterium to humans. But imagine trying to solve that mystery without knowing that microorganisms existed. You might look at the sick person. You might inspect their food. You might blame the water. You might notice strange smells in the streets. You might look toward the sky, but the actual pathogen would remain completely invisible. This is what made the Black Death so frightening. The enemy was there, but nobody could see it. When people don't know the cause of a disaster, they search for explanations. And during the Black Death, medieval societies produced many different explanations. One influential medical idea involved miasma, the belief that harmful or corrupted air could contribute to disease. Bad smells therefore became associated with danger. People tried to avoid foul air. Some burned aromatic substances. Others carried herbs or fragrant materials. Physicians attempted to interpret the disease through the medical theories available to them. Much of European medicine was influenced by the older traditions of Greek and Roman medicine. The theory of the four humors was particularly important. According to this framework, the body depended on the balance of four bodily fluids. Disease could be understood as an imbalance within the body. So when plague appeared, physicians were trying to solve an enormous biological mystery using a medical framework that had no knowledge of bacteria. That distinction is important. They weren't simply refusing to investigate. They were investigating with the tools and knowledge available to them. But their most fundamental assumption about disease could be wrong. And when the underlying cause is wrong, even intelligent observations can lead to incorrect conclusions. Religion also played an enormous role in medieval life. For many people, a devastating epidemic was interpreted through religious beliefs. Prayer became part of the response. Some people viewed the catastrophe as divine punishment. Others searched for religious explanations for why entire communities were suffering. But tragedy created another danger. When people become frightened and don't understand what is happening, they may search for someone to blame. During the Black Death, Jewish communities in parts of Europe were falsely accused of poisoning wells, and deliberately spreading the plague. These accusations were completely unfounded. They led to horrific persecution and violence. The disease was not caused by Jewish communities. It was caused by a biological pathogen. But medieval people didn't know that pathogen existed. And this shows one of the darkest sides of the pandemic. The plague didn't only attack bodies. It also attacked social trust. People became suspicious. Rumors spread. Fear grew. And sometimes innocent people became targets. Now imagine yourself living in one of these communities. You hear that several people have become sick. You don't know how the disease spreads. You don't know whether the person standing next to you is infected. You don't know whether leaving the city will protect you. You don't know whether staying home will protect you. And you don't know whether the medicine being offered will actually work. If you lived during the Black Death, what would you have believed was causing it? Bad air? Contaminated water? A supernatural punishment? Or something nobody had discovered yet? Once someone became seriously ill, the next question was obvious. What could be done? Medieval physicians had treatments, but they were working without modern microbiology, antibiotics, or laboratory diagnosis. Some treatments were based on the theory of humoral balance. Others involved herbs, dietary changes, preparations, or procedures that were part of medieval medical practice. Bloodletting was also used within the medical traditions of the period. The problem was that none of these approaches could directly attack Yersinia pestis. The physician could see the symptoms. They could feel the patient's fever. They could observe the swelling. They could watch the patient's condition change. But they couldn't identify the bacterium causing the disease. Imagine being a physician during an outbreak. A patient is lying in front of you. Their family is watching. Everyone wants an answer. Everyone wants you to do something. But you have no laboratory, no bacterial culture, no modern diagnostic test, no antibiotic. You have only the medical knowledge you've inherited. You might try a treatment because generations of physicians have used it. You might change the patient's diet. You might use herbs. You might attempt procedures believed to restore balance. You might recommend avoiding certain environments. And if the patient becomes worse, you may try something else. But the pathogen continues its biological process regardless of what you believe about it. That is one of the most important differences between medieval and modern medicine. Modern treatment can be based on understanding the specific organism involved. Medieval treatment was often based on theories about what was happening inside the body. The difference was not simply better medicine versus worse medicine. It was a difference in knowledge of disease mechanisms. And that difference could mean everything. Because when a disease is caused by something invisible, identifying the cause is the first major step toward controlling it. But the Black Death was already moving through populations. And soon, the consequences became impossible to ignore. At first, life could continue almost normally. Markets opened. People worked. Merchants traveled. Families visited one another. Then the number of sick people increased. A house became silent. A neighbor disappeared. A market became less crowded. A family stopped appearing in public. People began hearing stories from other towns. The disease had become more than an illness. It was becoming a community-wide crisis. The psychological pressure was enormous. People feared losing their parents, their children, their friends, their neighbors. And because the cause was unclear, fear could spread alongside the disease. Some people fled affected areas. Others stayed to care for sick relatives. Some communities attempted to restrict movement. Different regions responded differently, but there was no single, modern global public health system coordinating the response. The pandemic continued to take lives, and its demographic impact was enormous. The exact death toll is still debated by historians. Estimates vary, but tens of millions of people died during the wider pandemic. The often repeated figure of around 75 million is an estimate, not a precise historical count. What is not disputed is the scale of the catastrophe. In many parts of Europe, an enormous proportion of the population died. And when millions of people disappear from a society, almost everything changes. There were fewer workers, Fields needed labor. Businesses lost employees. Landowners struggled to maintain production. Families disappeared. Communities were left with empty homes. And survivors suddenly found themselves living in a world with a completely different population. The economic consequences were significant. In many regions, surviving workers became more valuable because there were fewer people available to do the same work. Labor relationships changed. Wages could increase. Some traditional social arrangements came under pressure. The Black Death, therefore, didn't simply change medicine. It changed economics. It changed communities. It changed population structures. It changed people's relationship with death. And it changed the course of European history. But one mystery remained. What exactly had caused this catastrophe? For centuries, humanity still didn't have the complete answer. The Black Death eventually faded from its initial 14th century peak. But plague did not disappear from the world. Outbreaks continued to occur in later centuries. Humanity continued trying to understand infectious disease. Then science began opening a completely new world. Microscopes allowed scientists to observe organisms that human eyes could never see. The development of germ theory changed medicine. Researchers such as Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch helped establish that microorganisms could cause specific diseases. Now the old question, why are people becoming sick, could be investigated in a completely different way. Scientists could search for a physical cause. They could isolate organisms. They could study transmission. They could connect specific pathogens with specific diseases. Eventually, researchers identified the bacterium associated with plague, Yersinia pestis. Suddenly, the Black Death was no longer simply an unexplained medieval catastrophe. It had a biological explanation. The swollen lymph nodes had a connection to an infectious disease. The fever had a biological cause. The transmission had an ecological explanation. The mysterious enemy finally had a name. But identifying the bacterium was only one step. Science continued to develop. Researchers studied how plague circulates between animals and vectors. Public health systems improved. Disease surveillance became more sophisticated. Quarantine and isolation practices became more organized. Laboratory diagnosis became possible. And eventually, antibiotics transformed the treatment of bacterial infections. This was the real turning point. Humanity didn't defeat plague by discovering one magical cure. It developed an entire system of knowledge. Microbiology, epidemiology, laboratory medicine, public health, and effective antimicrobial treatment. Each discovery reduced another piece of the mystery. Now imagine the same disease appearing in the modern world. A person develops symptoms that make doctors suspect plague. The response would be completely different from the 14th century. Doctors could evaluate the patient's clinical signs. Laboratories could test for evidence of the infection. Public health authorities could investigate potential exposure. The specific form of plague could be considered, and appropriate antibiotics could be used. That doesn't mean plague is harmless today. It remains a serious infectious disease. But the difference is enormous. A medieval physician could observe the disease. A modern medical team can investigate the organism causing it. A medieval community could only guess how an invisible illness was spreading. Modern epidemiologists can investigate transmission patterns. A medieval patient had no antibiotics. Modern medicine has effective antibiotic treatments for plague when they are given appropriately and promptly. That is the contrast that matters. The biggest difference between the 14th century and today isn't that modern. Humans are somehow biologically different. It's that we understand the enemy. The Black Death began as an invisible biological process, but its consequences became visible everywhere. In homes, in markets, in villages, in cities, in fields, in families, and eventually, across entire continents. Millions of people died. Millions more survived. And the survivors inherited a world that had been permanently changed. The Black Death reminds us that a disease doesn't need to be visible to transform civilization. A microscopic organism can change economies. It can change populations. It can change politics. It can change medicine. And it can change the way humans understand the world around them. For medieval people, the plague was an enemy they couldn't see. For modern science, that same enemy has a name: Yersinia pestis. And that difference represents centuries of scientific progress. But now I want to know what you think. If you had lived during the Black Death, would you have stayed in your town or tried to escape? And here's the bigger question. Do you think medieval people could have discovered the real cause of the plague if they had the scientific knowledge we have today? And finally, if the Black Death suddenly appeared today, do you think modern medicine would stop it before it became another global catastrophe? Leave your answer in the comments. Because the most fascinating part of this story isn't only how many people died. It's how humanity went from looking at a mysterious disease to identifying the microscopic organism behind it. The Black Death was once an invisible mystery. Today, we can understand the biology behind it. And that journey, from fear to observation to science, is one of the most remarkable transformations in human history.